what we're doing today, the things, we put out at the beginning kind of a description of each day, but they change slightly as we go along. What we're looking at this morning is how we get from Jesus walking around teaching in Palestine to this full-blown theology of the Christ, right? The pre-existent Christ that's there before Jesus. How do we get there? And I wanted to start by looking in the New Testament itself, because the New Testament was put together over a long period of time, and views about that issue changed during that time, right? So we can see the evidence of that growth. Let's look at, for just a minute, at the kind of the chronology of how the New Testament got put together. Let me back up this a little bit. We start with Paul's letters, right? Paul is operating in the late 50s and early 60s, and he's writing letters to churches. His earliest letter, probably his First Thessalonians, might have been written as early as 58, right? Or probably around 59, more likely. And Paul was martyred in the middle of the 60s. So all of those letters have to fit between about 58 and 65, right? In that little time. So we get those letters. That's what starts out. The earliest churches would have had one of those letters, maybe, or two of them. Around the year 90, somebody gathered them together. We don't know who did that, right? And published a book with just Paul's letters, right? And so around the year 90, up here on our timeline, up toward the end, we get an actually published version of Paul's letters that's floating around among the churches, and suddenly they all seem to know about all of the letters, right? The next step in that process is the writing of the Gospels. This is important to keep in mind because it means that when Paul wrote his letters, there weren't any Gospels yet, right? And so the stuff that we know from the Gospels, Paul might not have known, right? And so there are, he's writing, and what he has to say about Jesus is not informed by any of those stories that are in the Gospels, right? It may be, some of those may have been out there in the oral tradition, and he might have known them, right? But there was no document that he could point to and to have people read about a story about Jesus. So you get those four Gospels. It's pretty clear that three of them are really interdependent. There's a lot of overlap between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? And the earliest of those was probably written around 69. So a few years after Paul died, right? And so we could debate about the order in which they were written. Most scholars today think Mark was written first, then Matthew, then Luke, but that's debatable, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about that. Key to what we're going to be doing this morning is that John clearly comes from a later time period, right? John's gospel. So there would have been a time where churches were aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John wasn't around yet, right? We're going to read a passage from John, and it'll be important to have that in mind as we're reading that passage from John. Then after beginning around the late 80s, right, we get other letters starting to appear. Can we think of any other letters in the New Testament besides Paul's? What are some of the other letters? Yeah. And don't be shy. Well, we have some letters of Peter in there. We have the three letters of John, right? We have the letter to the Hebrews, the letter of James, right? So we get these other letters that start appearing in the late 80s, and that would go up even into the 90s. Much later, some people would begin to attribute the letter to the Hebrews as with Paul, but the problem is that it wasn't written in the lifetime of Paul, right? And if you're reading it in Greek, it clearly sounds very different. It's not the way Paul writes, and it's not a letter, right? It doesn't have the typical introduction that a letter has. It's more like a sermon that got published, right? And so anyway, that one fits down in this later period. Down in that period, you're also going to get the book of Revelation, right? Which is probably sometime in the 90s, right? And so that will wrap it up. There would be a lot of other books written as well that would get circulated around in the early church, but these are the ones that end up in the New Testament, right? And so they're all written before the year 100, but some of them pretty late, right? Up in the 90s.
Is Jude also included in that?
Yes, Jude. Thank you. Right, I left that one out. Yeah,
I don't know. I mean,
yeah. And the letter Jude is probably written around the time of the book of Revelation. So it tends to be, most scholars date it pretty late, up in the early 90s sometime. So, but there's clearly room for debate around that. Right, and so the letter, what we do know is that Jude is one of the last letters accepted into the New Testament. There were churches that debated about whether it was authentic or not, right? And because it appeared so late, right? And so you have a good bit of debate about it. Let's go on now and let's read a passage from Paul, and then a passage from John. Those are separated by 25 to 30 years, right? And we can clearly see some development on this issue of the cosmic Christ, we might say, and Jesus' connection to that, right? So let's go to Paul first, and this comes from the introduction to the letter to the Romans. And so we're going to read through it, and a lot of it's about Paul, but there's this little comment that comes in the middle, and we'll see, what is Paul assuming here about Jesus, right? So let's read it. It says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son. So here we have Jesus, right? The gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead, Jesus our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles for the sake of his name, including yours, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. So what does Paul claim about Jesus here? It says, according to the flesh, he's descended from David. And then
that he is the Christ.
He is the Christ. And what's this business about declared to be the Christ by the resurrection from the dead? How do we read what Paul's assuming there? Right? Scholars struggle with this, and they say, well, we've got a couple of different options here. Either he thinks that Jesus was born, lived his life, got crucified, and then when he rose from the dead, that's what made him the Christ, right? The resurrection. Either he thinks that, or he thinks he was always the Christ, right? But nobody knew that, or most people didn't know that until the resurrection, right? And so he's declared to be the Christ through the resurrection. That's what declares it, makes it public. When the Gospels start to get written, this is exactly what Mark assumes, right? Mark, throughout his Gospel, has Jesus telling people, don't tell anybody about that, right? When he heals somebody from the dead, right? He'll say, now go cleanse yourself, but don't tell anybody. And of course they go tell everybody, right? And so they violate it. But it seems like he's trying to keep his role as the Christ secret until the resurrection, right? And which it becomes public, right? It becomes broadly known. He and his disciples know it, right? But nobody else does, and the wider public doesn't know it until the resurrection. So maybe Paul's assuming something like that, right? That Jesus was always the Christ, and then it's just that most people didn't know that. It's just when he was raised from the dead, that's what proved it to everybody. He was declared to be the Christ by the resurrection from the dead. What we clearly don't see here is any assumption that Jesus was the Christ before he was born. Does that make sense? Right? We see two possibilities for either he comes in, he lives his life, and he becomes the Christ when he rises from the dead, or he's born, he's the Christ, right? And his disciples know that, but nobody else does. And then the resurrection is which declares it, right? But he doesn't Paul never makes an assertion that Jesus was there before the birth, right? That's something that we're going to find in the Gospels, but not in Paul, right? And so Paul doesn't assume that. Let's go on about 25 to 30 years later, we're going to get the final version of John's Gospel. So let's read this. This is a little bit of a longer passage, and it's going to sound very familiar to you. I've left out a couple of verses. You notice how this goes to verse 5 and then jumps to verse 9. That's because the verses 6, 7, and 8 are about John the Baptist, right? So the part about Jesus skips those verses. And so let's read what it says about Jesus, and then we'll talk about what the implications of this are. Clearly, this does assume that Jesus always existed long before his birth, right? So we have here, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Now, we're going to finish the passage in a minute, but just want to point something out. Does it ever say the name Jesus? No, it says the Word, right? In the verses that follow, it's clearly going to say Jesus is the Word. So he's not going to leave that ambiguous, right? He's going to say that later. He's going to say the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we have seen his glory, right? So he's going to connect it clearly with Jesus, and throughout the Gospel of John, he assumes that the Word is Jesus. In the composition of the Gospel of John, most scholars think that took about 20 years, that you get an early version, then you get later editing, you get more editing, and one of the last pieces in that process is this passage. That is, somebody takes a poem about the Word, quotes it, and says, Jesus is that, right? The Word in Greek society out there, the logos, was a Stoic idea. It's this notion that that throughout the history of the world, there's been this force of divine reason that's out there, and they call that the Logos, right? The divine reason that's always been there. In early Christianity, in the earliest days of Christianity, we had two competing views of how that fit into Christianity. One said, that's Sophia, right? Do we know, we've heard of Sophia before? Sophia is the personification of wisdom, that the Logos is Sophia. And so it's feminine here. That doesn't fit very well with Jesus, right? Jesus is a guy, right? And so a competing view was, no. The Logos is Jesus, not Sophia, right? So we can see this passage in John as taking a stand on that issue, right? Saying, who's the Word, right? Jesus is the Word, not Sophia, right? And so you get this this kind of taking a stand on the debate. Also, we know that within earliest Christianity, this whole issue of the pre-existence of Jesus was a huge debate. In fact, not until the Council of Nicaea in the 300s would the main bishops throughout the world get together and say, okay, which is it? Was he pre-existent or was he not pre-existent, right? What's his relationship to the Father? A group of Christians called the Arian Christians, they get declared heretics at the Council of Nicaea, right? Their view of this was Jesus was born as God's son, and that's where he started, right? God, through Mary, right, has Jesus, and that's the beginning of the Christ right there, right? And that means that the Christ is always dependent on the Father. The Father is kind of higher than the Christ, if you will. They're both divine, right? But one is dependent on the other one. Jesus, the Christ, is dependent on the Father, right? And so this is Arian Christianity. What the Council on the Nicaea is going to say is, no, that's all wrong. They take the stand of the other big theological strand that's moving forward. And that is that the Christ has always been there, has always been equal to the Father, right? And so you get this declaration that the Arians are heretics, right? That Jesus is equal to the Father, and they're developing this theology of the Trinity, right? And so you get in Council of Nicaea, they say this is the official stance. Something to understand historically is that was the Roman position, right? Those bishops that got called together by Constantine in 325 were from churches within the Roman Empire, right? The Arians had been way more effective missionaries than what would eventually become the Catholic Church, right? The Arians had already, by the time of the early 300s, converted most of the Germanic tribes to the north of Rome. When Rome fell to the barbarians, if you say, right, they were falling mostly to the Arian Christians, right? Those tribes, most of them, not all of them, some of them were still pagan, right? But by the time you get the fall of Rome, right, the majority of them are no longer pagan; they're Arian Christians, right? And so you get this military conflict between them later. So what happened at the Council of Nicaea is you get the Romans saying, we approve of the pre-existent Christ, the one that's always been there. He is the Word, right? And they're taking that side. Their opponents, the Germanic tribes, are on the other side of that debate, and they come over to the Roman view when they conquer the Roman Empire, right? They don't conquer the church, right? And so eventually that Roman view that Jesus has always existed, that the Christ has always been there, is the one that's going to win out, right?
I have a question,
Yes.
and this
Right.
may or may not be related, so feel free to tell me to
Okay.
carry
Yeah.
myself off. So you were talking about Logos and Sophia,
Yes.
right?
Right.
So don't both of those words have a pretty distinct difference traditionally as it would have come up to the writing of John?
Yes, they do. And so you have, and that's a good point. Thank you. The Sophia is literally the Greek word for wisdom, right? It's a little odd that in the Jewish community, the way they translated the wisdom literature, the wisdom tradition, is with logos, not with Sophia. Right, and so they called it logos. As they became more Hellenized, right, that is more Greek influence, they decided this notion of the logos is what squares with the wisdom tradition in the Old Testament, right? And so you get this identification of the wisdom of God as being the logos. Right, but there's a competing tradition with that has always said the wisdom of God is Sophia, wisdom, right? The Greek word for wisdom, Sophia. That's Sophia. In fact, the church at Constantinople, which by the time of the 325s it's pretty ironic that it's named the Church of Sophia, right? It's Sophia. Not there in Constantinople, but Nicaea is not far from Constantinople, in which they decide, no, it's not Sophia, it's the Logos, right? And so Jesus is the Logos. And part of this is very gendered thinking, if you will. The word Logos in Greek is masculine, right? Jesus is a guy, right? And so it's easier in their thinking to think of Jesus as the Logos than of thinking of Jesus as Sophia, right? Because Sophia is feminine, right? And so there's this masculine feminine thing going on too, right? And which word do we use? Do we use Logos? Do we use Sophia, right? And so they end up going with Logos, right? The masculine version, because Jesus is a guy, right? And so in part, now it's more complicated than that, but that's a part of the picture of what's going on, right? Is that they're trying to say, how do we best talk about Jesus, especially with this growing feeling that Jesus had always been there, that not the physical Jesus, but Christ has always been there since the beginning of time. Right? Because the Greek tradition, that's what they said about the Logos. It's always been there, right? It's as long as there has been humanity, there has been the Logos, the divine reason, right? And so you get, as the church, I think it's important to keep in mind that the church is really struggling with how to make sense of what happened with Jesus. How do we make any sense out of that, right? And one way to do that is say Jesus was representing something much bigger, right? Something that we all know about, we all assume that the wisdom of God is there throughout history, right? That from the Greek way of putting it, the Logos has always been there, divine reason, that force of good in the world to bring about right and good and justice, right? That's always been a part of the picture. It wasn't new with Jesus, right? Jesus is that. Does that make sense? Right? So that is what Jesus is. And so the church is going to end up there. But it's important to understand the historical context that they're finding by the time those bishops meet in Nicaea, right? They're arguing for the dominant Roman side of that debate. And a huge swath of Christianity is outside that. the Arians, right? They don't believe that stuff. They say, no. Jesus was born in Palestine, and when he resurrected from the dead, God declared him to be the Logos, right? But he wasn't literally there at the beginning, right? John's gospel says you're wrong on that, right? He was always there. He was in the beginning. He was the Logos, right? And so there's a theological battle going on in early Christianity that we see in the documents, reflected in the documents themselves. And then, of course, in the history after that, we know the very bloody consequences, actually, as the Arians are repressed, right? And you even get the collapse of Rome and the fights there, and those Arians slowly convert over to the Trinitarian side of understanding what's going on in the New Testament. So it's a long history, right? But we can clearly see that development going on in the New Testament itself, where you're moving more and more toward saying Jesus existed beforehand. Jesus, not Jesus, the physical guy, but Jesus is the embodiment of something that had always been there. It had always been around since the beginning of time. And John is the one in the New Testament that most clearly says, yep, that's it, right? That Jesus is this, it's the Word, the Logos, and which made it much easier, actually, for talking about the significance of Jesus in a Greek-speaking world. Okay, outside Palestine, as Christianity spread, it made it easier to win that debate with the Arians, if you will, to say, look, we've always assumed there was divine reason. We've always known that. It's always been around as long as God has been around, and that's Jesus. Right? So, what do you think about this? Do you have thoughts about the importance of seeing Jesus as pre-existent? Is that something that we would still say that's really important, right? Or is that a debate for the early church that today's Christians is, what do you feel? How does that land for us? We will pick back up next week with Herman, and I'll talk with Herman. Maybe we'll have some time to discuss these issues later down the road as well. But I appreciate the two of you being here. I know there's a lot competing with us this morning, right? So I hope you have a beautiful day. I'll see you.